Hi, Clara here, and I'm from MIT. So thank you for the compliment.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My question regards you gave an example of your son knowing how to use the computer versus writing. Okay, so with all of these systems, there could be the uneventable, perhaps uh, doing with the haves versus have-nots. So when you also talk about diamonds in the rough, I mean, how are you dealing with situations like those that have come out of incarceration, immigrants, and those like even with credit cards? Some people can't get credit cards, so they don't have a credit score. So there could be a good segment that is lost that would want to contribute to the workforce. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, and I love this. So I was fortunate enough to write an article for Forbes around second chance, for example. So we'll hone in on that one specifically, but let's just make this a blanket topic for those that may be less fortunate or have circumstances that inhibit them from other people in the employment market. So 77 million people in America have an arrest record, and it's now such an issue when you go through a background check for companies, that it's actually causing talent shortages because people have been arrested for anything, and now because they have an arrest record are now no longer able to work at certain companies. And it is a real issue because the reality is that what are you doing with that? Well, one, you are creating a cyclical effect. Prevent someone from gainful employment. What will they do? They will continue to offend. Okay, because if you put someone in a cage for long enough, they're going to turn wild, right? Because there's nothing that they can do. They can't work themselves out of their issue, which they should absolutely have the right to do. Secondly, people have a right to make a mistake. Okay, and I think that there should be a gravity towards those mistakes, which I would imagine will be part of the validation process. So I think in this country, most people, even the most unprivileged, have probably access to a computer somewhere, or in a library, or maybe a phone or a smartphone that would allow them to create a digital version of themselves that could go through validation, right? And part of that validation may be looking at their history or record, criminal record, etc. And I think that there needs to be some level of scoring that sits around that. I.e., if you were in California 20 years ago and you got caught with cannabis, I don't even know why you still even got it on your goddamn record. But apparently you can't get employed because you still have an arrest record. It's like, oh my goodness. This is also affecting people from hiring because companies will have a protocol in place that won't allow this talent to come into the company. So you're missing out on a great hire, and that hire is missing out on a honest, gainful employment opportunity. So these are also areas where if we use, beyond just the validation of resume data, if we just create a much more sophisticated protocol that just analyzes human beings on every level and starts applying a much more logical process to whether or not we analyze someone for the purposes of gainful employment, rather than just these blanket statement yes or no's, which really don't suit society today. Because when 77 million people have been arrested at some point, you have to ask yourself the question, is there an issue with the system? Probably yes, more than any other country on the planet, to the point where I believe that your arrest records surpass almost most of Europe in its entirety, which is a lot. So that's my point. And then for those as well who maybe not have access, we don't all have access to smartphones, stuff like that. But I will use the example of when you look at how many people are on Facebook, Instagram, stuff like that. I would say, because I come from a place in the UK called Luton, and probably none of you ever have heard of it, but it was voted the worst place to live in the whole of England every year, statistically.
Because you were from there.
Yes, yeah, I was a reprobate, so somewhat, and but it very under economically developed, economically deprived area. But even in an area like that, which was one of the most poorest and undeveloped areas in the whole of the UK, everyone still had a Facebook page. Most of my friends who I grew up with, who come from poor homes, broken homes, homes that were fueled by drugs and drug abuse and stuff like that, still had a Facebook and had an Insta and stuff like that, or in the UK, we had a thing called Bebo, which I think you guys had here, but it got bought by AOL and then destroyed. So, but nonetheless, we had them. So which means there is a point where you have a responsibility as a human being that if you need to get yourself out of a situation, you need to go and find a way to get yourself out of a situation. There are public libraries. There are places that you can go to utilize resources to create a profile for yourself. You could probably walk into a recruitment agency and say, I'm broke, I'm poor, and I need to create a profile for themselves. I'm pretty certain that most branches of Kelly Services and Adecco would welcome you with open arms and allow you to create a profile for yourself. So there are ways to do it. You just have to be somewhat proactive to work your way out of that situation.
Sure, yeah. And this is it's such a challenging thing to address also, right? It's actually something, and I don't want to overtake this whole talk.
But
it's actually something that's very near and dear to myself and things that we've done at our firm. I'm a convicted felon myself, but I'm also a patent attorney and I'm the founder of the fastest growing intellectual property law firm the last 3 years in a row in the United States. When I first applied for college, I didn't know how to do that or anything like that, right? It's easy to say just go to the library or something like that, but I didn't have the first clue of how to do any of those things, right? Like I knew there was these computers there, right? And I didn't use them for useful purposes. I mostly just messed around and tried to figure out what they were all about a little bit every once in a while. But most of my life, it wasn't. I wasn't utilizing technology in that way, right? I love what you said about life is a team sport, right? Yeah. That's what it is. It's the unfortunate answer, I think, to this question, right? Is that life is a team sport, and in this particular social issue is something that I think that we all need to put our best foot forward on, right? And to remember to remember forgiveness more than contempt for others in writing them off, because. One thing that I've learned throughout my own life is I know exactly what it feels like to think that I'm right and to be wrong. And I hope that I don't do that much more in my life, but I know I will, right? And so I'm always willing to learn more, And so I guess I would just ask everyone in the audience to kind of open your heart to that concept that what you know should be subject to revision, and what we know about others and those that work around us should also be.
And you're not selling yourself enough. You are PhD grad,
yep.
Founded your own business from scratch with no capital invested. You've built it with one of the most successful firms in the country, according to Inc., the fastest growing law firm.
Yep. You
employ tons of people. You're a great boss. Everybody loves you. But
most of them.
They do. But it was one of the things that I love about him the most is his story. But he is a convicted felon, right? He did make a mistake, right? He did, okay? And he did what he had to do for it too. And transparency, for anyone who has it, I'm also a convicted felon too. So I made mistakes too when I was young because I grew up in a really, really bad town. And but that was 20 years ago, right? Since then, married, kids, and also have built a business now that has over 9 figures in revenue, right? And I employ hundreds and hundreds of people, and I put thousands of people to work. And the positive impact that we both have on society today outstretches any of the negative that we did 1,000 times over.
But it's mainly when we both work for ourselves, though, too, is because we were unemployable.
Yeah, we were unemployable,
right?
Yeah,
and so,
true.
And that's kind of the point, is that's what we were forced into. This is really kind of sidetracking this whole conversation.
But it actually turned out for the best. Sorry. So Bernard's not crying on his shoulder and stuff like that. Listen, it does need some context. I think what you brought there is such a great point. I'm so grateful as well. Someone of your sophistication at MIT is looking at it that way, because it can be easy to cast away individuals. But the reality is that there are diamonds in the rough. That's why your question about struck a chord with my heart, because I love MIT and the great prestige and the brilliant talent you bring out of this institution has had a huge impact on this world, right? And it continues to do so. But every now and again, there are human beings like ourselves that sadly slip through that net. But we also are slightly late bloomers, and we also deliver a lot to this universe. And so utilizing technologies to try and provide some more context behind that, so that we don't allow 77 million Americans to sit on the bench, because I guarantee you there are more diamonds in that rough, and there could be talent that could really make a positive impact. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. There's work to do, and don't give up.
Don't leave me.
Sorry. We didn't rehearse that part.
I know.